Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new Record Club episode of the Jams Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And today, this week, we are covering Tyler's recommended album. It is Modest Mouse, The Lonesome Crowded West. Tyler, why don't you tell us a bit about Modest Mouse and a bit about The Lonesome Crowded West?
Gladly. So, Modest Mouse are a Washington-based band, a classic indie rock band. In the 90s, they released a string of seminal records that remain some of the most beloved and influential in all of indie rock. The first being 1996's This Is a Long Drive for Someone with Nothing to Think About. The second of which being The Lonesome Crowded West, the album we're going to be discussing today. And then the third of which, actually, there were four technically, because the third was a compilation album called Building Nothing Out of Something, which on most days of the week is my favorite Modest Mouse album, probably the greatest compilation record of all time of songs that didn't make it onto any other records. And then their third studio album, fourth album proper, if you include Building Nothing, Moon in Antarctica, which came out in 2000. A legendary run of incredible indie rock records that have an emotionally rich songwriting, dynamic and hard-hitting and loud arrangements, and just for teenage me, Modest Mouse, and specifically that 96 to 2000 era of Modest Mouse, absolutely were a fixture and influenced the way that I approached music, what I valued in music, and what I loved so much about rock music and indie music, and basically everything that Modest Mouse owes its influence to, and that is influenced by Modest Mouse. Interestingly enough, in like general music discussions of Modest Mouse, I think this classic era of their most beloved records tends to get overshadowed by the more commercial era that followed in the 2000s, which is a shame. I do think there's some good stuff in their post 2000s era, but it's more that at least that the records themselves are great, although I will stand up for 2007's We Were Dead Before the Ship Even Sank, which was the album where Johnny Marr of the Smiths joined the band to play lead guitar. And that is a really good album, but it's also an inconsistent album. Their big crossover record, Good News for People Who Love Bad News, as well, is a pretty inconsistent record, though I do have some sentimental attachments to parts of it. And then their last record, 2015 Strangers to Ourselves, was a complete fucking mess. And the reason why I mean, aside from the fact that I think that the classic era of Modest Mouse is great and that The Lonesome Crowded West is a great album, the reason I selected for Record Club specifically was because Modest Mouse are putting out a new record this year, their first since Strangers to Ourselves 6 years ago, The Golden Casket, and frankly, my hopes are not high for that particular record. Modest Mouse, I don't think are a bad band now. I even think that Strangers to Ourselves, which is a just absolute disaster of a record, still has some really good songs on it. Just a whole lot of bullshit as well. And so they're a band where I think it's easy to forget why they're so beloved. And they're not really talked about by the kind of Gen Z that much anymore, as much as they're talked about by millennials who experienced that classic era, or people like me who are technically Gen Z, but through their interest in 90s music, got to experience that era as a teenager, retrospectively anyway. And so because I know that, well, I knew that none of you had heard this particular album, but I also knew that none of you were really like fully in the bag for Modest Mouse anyway. I wanted you all to experience this record, and I wanted to have a chance to talk about why it's special above and beyond just being, cool indie rock album. Modest Mouse, one of the most endearing things, one of the most exciting things about Modest Mouse is that even though they're a reasonably scrappy kind of three-piece band, they consist of lead singer and guitarist Isaac Brock, drummer Jeremiah Green, and bassist Eric Judy. Even though they're a reasonably kind of scrappy three-piece band, they have a lot of ambition in these 96 to 2000 records. Like, these are albums that go on for an hour plus, have lots of songs, lots of variation, and for me as a teenager, Isaac Brock was one of the first instances of an actual songwriter speaking to me, me actually connecting with a musician in terms of their writing and the things that they were singing about, and the very specific feelings and atmospheres and scenes that were evoked in their records. I think my favorite Modest Mouse record on most days of the week is The Moon in Antarctica. The Moon in Antarctica. The Moon in Antarctica, because that is more, I guess, specifically a record about being a kid and growing up and kind of being in awe of the size of the universe and your insignificance in it, and just being a teenager and all that sort of stuff. And those feelings are on the Lonesome Crowded West in parts as well. But this is, I think, a more broad album that deals generally a bit with ideas of the experience of living in a very specific place in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest of America, and experiencing a very specific time where uh, increasing urbanization in a lot of the smaller towns and gentrification was leading to a dramatic shift in the landscape and was contributing to a general malaise and a general atmosphere of, I guess, hopelessness that, as far as Isaac Brock could see, was absolutely just pervading his town of Issaquah, which is near Seattle, and a lot of the rural areas as well on the outskirts of and around that state, in Oregon and Montana and all those kinds of Pacific Northwest states. Now, obviously, I've never been to America. I've never experienced that specific setting. But the way that, and even though there are very specific references to very specific things, in Washington and in that environment in this record, Isaac still sings about those things, and Isaac still creates a record thematically and topically that I'm able to thoroughly resonate with, because I can see and have experienced and have witnessed a lot of the things that he's talking about in that specific context here in the southern part of New Zealand, which I guess in its own way is kind of like New Zealand's equivalent of the Midwest or the Northwest, where it's this very, even though we're a small country, it's the southern part of New Zealand is also like a very desolate place where there's a lot of distance between major centers, and it's very mountainous and just kind of like beautiful as well. But also that rugged natural beauty of it is contrasted so starkly with the general, I guess, dourness and ugliness of some of the cities in the southern part of New Zealand. And having grown up, and it's interesting that we review this album this week, because I'm currently sitting in my childhood bedroom at home in the hometown that I'm originally from, a place called Invercargill. And uh, what's coincidental about the fact that we're reviewing it this week and I happen to be here is that this is a record that a lot of the things that resonate about it for me resonate because of the experiences I've had in this town growing up and the things that I've witnessed and continuing to witness as this sleepy southern town gradually changes and becomes something shinier and uglier and um, more depressing uh, with every passing year. And that's, I won't get into it with regard to my situation because that's irrelevant, but suffice to say, there's a resonance to this record and to the atmosphere and the emotions of this record in terms of growing up and witnessing a change in your world that is entirely outside of your control and is makes you feel like everything is doomed. And so there are specific references on this record to urbanization. One of my favorite songs on the record is the song "Convenient Parking," which is this absolutely it's this song that's about basically the urbanization of Issaquah, the increasing abundance of like strip malls, and the paving over of natural landscapes with parking lots, literally. I think in the documentary about this record, Isaac talks about how he read about how some of the most fertile land in all of America in the Northwest was like this natural, incredibly fertile natural land was just paved over for a parking lot and for a mall that was eventually just kind of basically abandoned. And that's another thing that Isaac talks about or sings about in certain parts of this record, is how there are like literal malls that will get built and then just abandoned and closed while they're building another one. And it's this sense of a kind of violation. And it's not necessarily that Isaac is super concerned with like nature and natural themes in this record. It's more just that he is coming from a place in his writing here where he's incredibly sort of depressed and touring a lot and just witnessing a lot of what you would describe as like urban decay and a homogenization of America. And it makes for some very compelling songwriting. And what is so engaging about Modest Mouse in this era is that they will be singing, or Isaac will be singing with real grit about these kinds of subjects, and he writes incredibly well. Incidentally, he writes very poetically in a way that might not be initially apparent because of the way that he delivers a lot of his vocals, which is again very varied. But I specifically like in Convenient Parking how he at the chorus of this track, he's basically just shouting and twisting those words. Convenient, yeah. I don't even want to do it because I'll embarrass myself by imitating him. But like he just contorts and twists the language, and he's like he adds like overdubs of himself like screaming the same words, and it just adds this sense of kind of like manic frenzy. And Modest Mouse have these two kind of modes on this record where it is alternately that manic frenzy, that kind of angry, manic, insane reaction to the world, and this kind of more reflective, sad and dour stuff that. And the album frequently flits between these two different modes in a way that I find quite striking. And I mean, there's references to bipolar disorder on the last song of the record that I think ties that musical shape shifting all together as well. But I'm not going to talk too much about this record because I want to have a bit of a discussion. But I will start by highlighting one song, which is my favorite song on the record. Or actually, I don't even know. It changes from listen to listen. But I think the most emblematic and representative song of this record, and a decent contender for the best Modest Mouse song, is Cowboy Dan, at the very center of this record.
I love that
Fuck
song.
yeah.
Which is basically a mission statement for the record, right? And it's a character study of this person, Cowboy Dan, who is very kind of like of a very particular era, an earlier era, who that is being left behind by this urbanization, by this increasing shift in the landscape. And he is this bitter character who very much struggles to it feels is left behind and is out of place in this new world, basically. And he reacts against that in desperate fury. There's one of the best and most famous lines in a Modest Mouse song is the line about how he drives to the desert, fires a rifle in the sky, and says, "God, if I have to die, you will have to die."
Oh, I fucking love that line.
Which is a great line, right? But I mean, every line here is fantastic. Just the insistent way that Isaac sings in this song and kind of like ratchets up the intensity throughout the verses, where it's like he's going to start a war. He's going to the reservation. He drinks and gets mean. He hops in his pickup. He puts his pedal to the floor and says, "I've got mine, but I want more." And then the way he ends this verse with that he didn't move to the city moved to me, and I want out desperately. Like, this is a character who is both kind of cartoonish in the things that he does, but also kind of genuinely tragic as well. And my favorite, what makes this a definitive Modest Mouse song, is not just that it captures that energy, but also that about halfway through the song kind of just fractures apart, and there's this bridge which is just the complete inverse musically and tonally of the rest of the song, where it's almost like this moment of tragic contemplation where he's standing in the tall grass thinking nothing. And it's like his fury has just kind of like led him to the point where he kind of falls into this kind of catatonic state where he has just the depression that is manifested in this anger has just overtaken him to the point where he is unable to move, and all he can think about is the fact that we need oxygen to breathe, which is a nice line because I mean it's more him saying that we are not independent in this world. We rely on the world to survive. We rely on there being stability. We rely on there being something we can hold on to. And Cowboy Dan is in this position where he feels like the things he's been able to hold on to, the normalcy, the tradition, the state of things are falling apart from him, falling away, being destroyed. And that is the source of his desperation, the source of his absolute tragedy and confused fury. Like it's a very tragic song, and it is in many ways the most definitive Modest Mouse song. But yeah, I've kind of introduced some of the sort of key themes of this record. There are other themes on this record that turn up as well. One of the other themes of this record, besides that increasing urbanization that turns up, is just the general desolation of the Northwest, which almost seems like a kind of contradiction at first, right? Because if Isaac is complaining about the increasing urbanization of his state, and then talking about how and then in the same album talking about how mind numbing and soul crushing it is to be traveling across it, like to be driving down these endless kind of wasteland roads. It seems like maybe like an initial bit of a contradiction, but I don't see it like that. It is a song that is where Isaac is expressing complex emotions that I certainly share about the place where I live, where it is this beautiful thing that I want to protect and that I want to remain the way that I have come to love it, but that also is infuriating in other ways as well. The monotony of touring is explored on this record, and a reliance on drug use too. Another one of the record's most definitive songs, I think, is Trucker's Atlas, which is just the fucking, and this is something as well that is one of the secret weapons of this band, is Jeremiah Green as a drummer is one of my favorite indie rock drummers ever. Maybe my favorite indie rock drummer, frankly. He's so dynamic. He's so hard hitting. The way the song comes in with his drum beat sounding like a steamroller across the track, like it's just so fucking heavy. And this is a song basically about driving across the Northwest. I think the character in the song is delivering drugs. It's a song about basically just getting really, really high and driving and driving and driving, and the monotony of this character who has to basically deliver drugs across the border. But it's also kind of like a bit of a metaphorical track where the subtext of it is that they're talking about the monotony of touring. And as well, and what I love about this song is that it has these great dynamics between the verse and the chorus, and the melodic changes in the first half of the track, and then it kind of just sits into a groove in the second half of the track that I absolutely love. There's this really kind of rollicking groove that moderates in intensity as it goes along, but it's a beautiful kind of like way of, because like the character in the song has to take drugs basically to survive these long drives. Basically, this direct references to coke and meth and stuff, and so it's a beautiful. The back half of this track is a nice kind of like musical representation of the monotony of the experience that is just driving this trucker stir crazy, and just the thing that makes a song work is a genuine kind of uh actual kind of pissed offness, like a rage that you can feel, that's rooted in real experiences that Isaac has had. You knew you were all hot, well maybe you'll go and blow a gasket. And just genuine senses of like, it's fragments of real experiences that he's had on the road touring, infused into this storytelling song. I know, I love that shit to bits. And so yeah, there's a lot of it's a very kind of wide tapestry of the of as Isaac sees it, the experience of living in this particular part of America in this particular time. And so I've talked a lot about, and I've only talked about two of the songs so far, but yeah, that's basically, I guess, the groundwork you really need to know to kind of understand this record, and the rest of the songs kind of fall into place once you kind of have that bedrock. But and we'll talk about certain other tracks in detail as well, although I'm sure some of you have favorites as well that you'll want to bring up. But yeah, what do you guys think of this record? And I mean, how did it compare to what you might have expected it to be?
I love this album. I was honestly, I was kind of surprised with how much I loved it. Even though I had heard and liked The Moon in Antarctica, which is funny because like these first two Modest Mouse albums, I don't really know much about this band at all, but it's really weird how it's like these first two albums, which are like they're nothing alike. Like for so many different reasons in terms of like energy and subject matter and concept and ambition. They're so different. Um, that said, I still didn't really know what to expect from this. I just knew like I saw the rate your music page for it, and it was just like 8 ratings, and it had like a 4.68, and I was just like, oh, all of my friends love this. Okay, and so I was just like, all right. And I will admit, it was definitely not love at first listen, mainly just because you throw on the first track, and it's immediately just like, bah, 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 bah.
Well, top of the ocean, yeah. At the bottom is nice, yeah, yeah. Well, I get claustrophobic, yeah.
Yeah.
That is way too tuneful to be a proper
Yeah,
imitation.
I was gonna say like the way this album just like kind of says fuck it when it comes to traditional melody is definitely it takes a bit getting used to, but like all things that I like that are a bit weird and offbeat is that it all circles lead back to one Mr. Tom Waits. And I end up enjoying this album in a really similar way that I enjoy something like Mule Variations, in that it's just and that comparison's not even like as skin deep as it might seem, is that I think the lyricism on this album is really comparable to the way Tom Waits writes songs. And that it's like, it's funny that we talked about the Wolf Alice record in terms of like what lyrics are meant to accomplish on that record this week. And how I think that like this is another great example of an album that's lyrics are really that they're used in a non-traditional way to great effect. And that like once you put them all together, I don't feel like they paint the most vivid of pictures, but like, you know, that you have songs like oh, it's one of the first ones, but it's an album, or it's a lyric that really stuck in my mind. It was just like the you bleed out onto the highways and you bleed out onto the parking lots. It's like a way of talking about traveling through them. And I was just like, that's just such an evocative image that like on its own, it's just like, it doesn't really like mean anything immediate, but like in the context of the greater record, it's like this feels like this almost raucous road trip in a way, like through the Midwest, or just like even on songs. I will say, Tyler, the first song you brought up, Cowboy Dan, one of my favorite songs on the record. That's like one of the perfect songs on here, in my opinion. But also the song that immediately follows it, Trailer Trash, I also think is a perfect song. Mainly just because you have these images like eating snowflakes with plastic forks as like, you know, like eating cereal and shit. And live in trailers with no class. Goddamn, I hope I can pass. High school means nothing. Taking heartache with hard work. This song is just such a fantastic portrayal, and a very real and raw portrayal of just like what it is to live in like the lower class of America. It's just like this entire album made me think of basically southeastern Kentucky, which is not the best place in the world. It's where my dad grew up. A lot of places like he lived in basically a trailer. It's basically the Kentucky is full of hills and mountains, and that place is like, it is the flattest place this side of the Mississippi. It is a wasteland, and all I could think of when listening to this album was that entire place and what it made me feel like. And in many respects, I think it's really, really great at conjuring that image without being like necessarily negative or one-dimensional. It's a very sympathetic, almost like coming of age character you get in songs like Trailer Trash, or in songs like the last one, or no, not the last one. No, the last two, I think, really, Bankrupt on Selling and Styrofoam Boots. But like you just sort of get this really vivid picture of not only the place like of this, this lonesome crowded West, but the people who inhabit it, which is really important. Especially on songs like Out of Gas and Long Distance Drunk, where it's sort of like these songs just sort of suit almost like a sole purpose, especially Long Distance Drunk, which is coincidentally, I think that might be my least favorite song on the record, even though I think it's a really good song. It's just really evocative of that feeling of being sort of like intoxicated, just wasted in this place, trying to reach out to somebody, and there's like this distance between you. And I think the approach to songwriting that I'm trying to highlight here is best exemplified, that sort of Waitsian thing by the track Jesus Christ Was an Only Child, where it paints this really strange image of, it's just like you have this sort of Jesus Christ figure who is like, in my opinion at least, is sort of like the protagonist who just, kind of thinks he's hot shit, like a teenager or something, and talks about like his dad, and it talks about like the stories that people hear around town to them, like people getting their hair done and like hearing these stories about him, and it just like, again, screams Mule Variations era Waits at me. And I love the sort of picture it paints, and Doing the Cockroach, one of my favorite songs on here too. Just boisterous, amazingly fun, also very makes me think of the storytelling that you would get on something like Rain Dogs. And then there are just songs on here that like it's definitely like the approach of the vocal delivery gets takes some getting used to, I think, just because like some songs on here are just so like I said, they have that weird approach to melody, but some songs on here are just straight up like post-hardcore songs. It's like fucking nuts. The genre that they sample from is everything from like traditional Midwest emo to Americana, and it manages to blend it all in this really, really distinct way that only Modest Mouse as a band I have seen channel to this effectiveness, I think. But they're just traditionally catchy songs, like Heart Cook's Brain, I think, is just a fucking rager. Also just a genuinely kind of sad song of just like, the way I read it is just sort of like the way that you, like, if you live by your emotions and live by way of that sort of like teenage angst, and sort of like living in this environment is sort of like, it basically like destroys your mind in a way. And I love that sort of, that seems to be the sort of point of view from which this entire record is told from. And I will also shout out Trucker's Atlas, which is the longest song on here, but I love how it makes you feel like it's, it's a journey that you're going on, like all of these places, all of these stops, and it has that sort of instrumental break at the end, which is fantastic. And the performances across this entire thing are passionate. They are loud. A lot of them are angry, but they're full of personality. And I say the last thing I'll say on it, just because this is an album that like a lot of Tyler's albums that he recommends on here, of like canon classic albums or albums that are important to him, this is an album that I think you really have to live with properly, just because of how there's so many ins and out, and so many like tight corners and things about this record that you get on multiple listens, and that the depth of the audio here is just so revealing about the way like the percussion of the album is so fucking energetic and fun, and even kind of bouncy and groovy on occasion. You just need to properly let it live with you. And as such, I will say that the score I will give the album is probably not representative of where it will land, but I feel like I can't do it justice, and my like rambling about it like this is just like, it's just such a virtuosic display, especially when you consider the fact that like two of the people in the band at this point were like 20 and 22, which is just fucking what? Yeah. God bless. Like, I will never make anything this good, and I'm 23. Fuck you. I hate you. But my favorite song on the album appears in a pretty fucking stellar run of tracks, but near the end, my favorite song on the record, which is Bankrupt on Selling.
That would be your
what
favorite.
A fucking song. This is just one of those songs that, like, on this record specifically, that just quietly breaks my heart. So lyrics like, and of all the angels, they'd sell off your soul for a set of new wings and anything gold. They remember the people they loved, their old friends, and I've seen through them all, seen through most everything, and all the people you knew were actors. and it's just like this level of disaffectedness. It actually does kind of remind me of lyricism that shows up on something like the Black Parade. It makes me think of the song Disenchanted, in how it's just all about how disaffected you are with the environment in which you live in, and how you're just sort of seeing this around you, this, like, I think the sort of urbanization and the sort of just like the development of things around you, and business and like corporate America and stuff just sort of building and gradually sucking away the life that you found in this place. And I love the end of how it's just like, it's also just sort of talking about the desire to escape all of that growing sort of metastasizing emptiness that you find, where it's got like, well, I'll go to college and I'll learn some big words and I'll talk real loud. Goddamn right, I'll be heard. You'll remember the guy that said all those big words that he must have learned in college. And that little like stanza there is so perfectly encapsulating of like the youth and like the innocence of which this is all told with, but also, and the desire to escape and the desire to like come back and the desire to be heard. And just, it's so loud too, of just like, it all just perfectly fits to be what it is. And it may not gel with you perfectly or anything, but like, you know, if you let it sort of seep into you, I think this is an album that just has an incredible longevity to it. I think that I'm going to come back to. That's basically, I think at this point, I'm basically just going to be in and start from the beginning over again of going through Modest Mouse catalog, because I can't not listen to more of the records that the Lonesome Crowded West made.
The golden run that I said of those 4 albums from 96 to 2000 are, I mean, they're all equally good, I think, in my opinion. If you like one, there's no reason you won't like the others.
Yeah.
I'll add to a couple of things that you said, and I know that Morgan will have some more to say as well, so I won't say too much. But just on the note of that song, Bankrupt on Selling, which is obviously one of the most, it's a big fan favorite track. It's very, very beloved, that song, and for good reason. It is heartbreaking. You're right. It's very difficult to listen to, not just because of the things that, not just because of the lyrics themselves, but also the very kind of defeated way that Isaac sings the song. He sounds youthful in a way that he doesn't really sound on most of the rest of this record. And he kind of leans into that in a way that makes it feel particularly heartfelt. And not that I think, you know, authenticity is required to sing about things necessarily, but Isaac never did go to college, and the sentiment in the song of wanting to be heard and wanting to be taken seriously is genuinely felt there. And it's not and what's really tragic about that particular stanza is that it's more, I guess, a mocking of the status that college gives people than a genuine desire to be, you know, to fit in. It's this notion that you'll go to college and you'll be heard, but all people will hear is that the words that you must have learned in college, and not the actual substance of what it is you're trying to say. And I guess Isaac is making an argument for his artistic expression as I guess a purer form of being than falling in line with the expectation that he'll go to college and that he will become influential in a more traditional way. I mean, earlier in the song, the lines about businessmen in unlimited hell buying and selling all their trash to each other and being bankrupt on selling is obviously a commentary on that kind of materialism that feeds into that expectation. And just the idea of being bankrupt on selling is a very kind of like tragic and beautiful poetic image. And that sort of, those kinds of ideas of kind of a bleak existence in a very kind of repetitive commercial world are hang across this entire record. Another song that is really heavy on that is one of my favorites on the record is Doing the Cockroach, which I love the idea of this song, which is that it takes the mundanity of life. Like the first verse of the song is like this fractured series of images of the protagonist kind of like taking the subway to work and having to listen to some random fucking dude just like yelling and just being drunk as hell, like you're totally hungover and you're just like, please shut up. And this scene of like being in this really kind of low situation where you're just like living the same day over and over again. And then like the idea of the literary device of taking that and making it like calling it like doing the cockroach, as if like you're describing a dance that everyone is doing, and using that particular way of describing it as the cockroach is a really kind of nice piece of imagery, and a really kind of like funny image as well. It's just a really awesome song, and I like that that song and Jesus Christ brought up Tom Waits to you, because I would have never thought of Tom Waits, but of course it makes so much sense as a reference point here from Jake's perspective. Yeah, and that sort of, and that's the thing, like this is a record that is quite sad and dark and angry frequently, but it's also very funny. And that's one of my favorite things about Modest Mouse as well, is that Isaac is the most like, he's an incredibly talented writer, and there's metaphors and imagery on this record that I have been sitting with for years and have still not even come close to unpacking. Like for instance, the song, the closing track on this record, which has a lot of religious imagery and metaphor, and stuff that I haven't even gotten close to fully unpacking. But there's all that, and he also just kind of makes you laugh with the most kind of like stupid stuff that the band in this era are able to fully pull off because of their just total irreverence and how hard they shred. Yeah, like there's more stuff on other songs that I'm happy to get into, but at this point I'd love to hear from Morgan, because I have no idea how Morgan would think would think about this record. Honestly, it could go any way. So I'm curious to hear how it's landed.
I'll start by saying that I have a lot of respect for this record, particularly in the way that it's written and the things it discusses. Jake and I are from the same town in Kentucky, which 15, 20 years ago was not all that different from the town that Jake described when he was talking about where his father's from.
Yep.
But in those 15, 20 years, we had a large automotive plant move in here, and thus a lot more people moved to this town, and it's, ballooned basically into this weird urbanization hybrid of a city and a small town. For the longest time, we only had one high school, but there was, it was probably like 3,000 students attending. And when I graduated, maybe even more than that, just like in a high school that was meant to accommodate less than half of that. And we only just recently got the second high school built. So the sentiment, it's like, basically to me, it reads as like, yeah, the place we live is kind of a shithole, but why are you trying to make it a different shithole with more McDonald's?
This is my shithole. Go find your own.
Yeah, it's just like one over there. Go invade that one. It's the kind of thing that saps you of your remaining pride in the place that you're from, because even if you hate it, you're like, at least it is what it is, and I know it. And then you suddenly look around and there's 15 chicken fast food places when you had the fucking KFC and that was it. And then so yeah, I definitely really latched on to the sentiments of this album and a lot of its moments. Where I'm sort of held at a distance is just, it really is not to have a stereotypically me complaint about this, but it really is just that guitar tone, which, like, it serves its purpose, and it's definitely a tone that has its purpose. But like, if I'm playing a guitar, I cannot just play it with clean, through the clean channel with no reverb or chorus or delay or anything. I don't care for it. And while it took me a while to accommodate to that on this album, I eventually did. But that said, I can mirror pretty much everything that Jake said about the writing of this album. Yeah, it feels like 15 individual short stories, and that's an approach to songwriting that I really love, and it really works here. But it does sort of just, sonically, it inhabits a world of not my thing. And while I can acclimatize to that and enjoy it, there is a lot of it, and it keeps me at arm's length to some degree in a way that I find really unfortunate.
I will say I was kind of expecting that. I guess my hope was that maybe you would overcome that. And I guess I can't be too surprised that it hasn't quite happened for you fully. I think that the two of you have kind of touched on some particular themes that are in this record that I'm pleased you, like me, have been able to relate to in terms of personal experience and where you grow up. Like, it's one of those great things in art where great artists can talk with great specificity about a very specific thing, and yet their specificity makes it universal, which is a sign of all great writers. And so some more things I'll just touch on. I talked at the start about how maybe the most definitive song here lyrically was Cowboy Dan, but I think maybe the most definitive song musically in terms of what Modest Mouse are about in this era is the opening track, Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine, which is, again, a classic song for this band if you're a fan. It's so much going on in this track. All of it brilliant in my opinion, but it is that throw you in the deep end opener where it's like, yeah, you're gonna get confronted with that very loud vocal style and that very particular guitar tone. The trademark Modest Mouse guitar effect thing is that kind of like discordant, delayed sound that you hear on a lot of songs of theirs, where it's like that. It appears at the very end of Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine, and it appears in various forms in a lot of Modest Mouse songs. I know that was a silly noise I made, but that is kind of how it sounds. And I
mean, there are many noises on this album that are indeed very silly.
But I love the way the guitar sounds of this record. It is very, it takes some adjusting to, absolutely. But once I adjusted to it as a kid, it was just like, and also I think it helps that the melodies on this record are really great too. Like Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine is just stuffed with great melodies. Songs like that and Cowboy Dan and Trucker's Atlas are great because it feels like every single verse has a different melody or a different kind of vocal thing that it's going for, or a different kind of chord progression, which is what keeps these songs so exciting. But yeah, Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine is this great introduction to the record. I like it kind of leans on some sort of iconographic imagery to present this urbanization theme. Here's the man with teeth like God's shoe shine. He sparkles, shimmers, shines. The malls are soon to be ghost towns, which again is a reference to that idea, well, not even idea, but that reality of the fact that in the late 90s, malls were just getting put up and then abandoned while the next one was put up. And this was something this very specific thing was something that infuriated Isaac, was not just the increasing urbanization, the increasing franchise incorporation into the city, but just the carelessness with the way that this town was bulldozed by stuff that was just meaningless, and that with no consideration for the long-term impact or whether it would add anything to the community or to the local economy or anything. It was just bulldozing. And then so that is a great theme. And another aspect of this record that's perhaps a little bit less touched on is, and I mean, actually, we were kind of already talked about it with the song Trailer Trash, but it's kind of like the desolate experience of growing up in this environment. There's some real kind of like goofy wordplay and images of like growing up on songs like Lounge Closing Time, which incidentally is this really awesome like progressive piece that builds to this huge climax and then just kind of like ends in this really desolate, empty place after that I love. And yeah, and there are some really just genuinely gut-wrenching moments on this record too. Like one of my absolute favorite Modest Mouse songs, another song that hasn't been touched on yet, and it's easy to see why with a record that is as dense as this, but Polar Opposites is quietly a brilliant song. It is again, the sentiment of the song is very simple. It is a song about being capital D depressed. The chorus is, I'm trying to drink away the part of the day that I cannot sleep away, which is, woo, that's a sentiment. And there's just there's a sense of kind of like uh, endless repetition in terms of the scene that's being set in this song. Polar opposites don't push away, specifically as a reference to bipolar disorder, where you kind of veering from one extreme to the other. It's the same on the weekends as the rest of the days. And then my favorite, one of my favorite lines in this record, I know I should go, but I'll probably stay. And that's all you can do about some things, where it's like you're just in the state of being so down that you can't move, you can't go anywhere, even when moving, going out, doing stuff would be the most healthy thing for you. You just cannot do that. And you have to accept the fact that you cannot do that, and that all that you can do sometimes is nothing. And you just have to live with that. And that's brutal, right? I love the visual imagery in this song. There's the lines, two one-eyed dogs, they're looking at stereos. Hi-fi gods try so hard to make their cars low to the ground. These vibrations oil its teeth. Primer gray is the color when you're done dying. So these imagery of like these people who are trying to stay young, stay modern, stay relevant and alive, but are just quietly dying, are through their conforming to the system that they're trying to appease. They basically like remove all of the genuine life from their souls. It's very dark stuff that Isaac really only, like, it takes some really real unpacking of these lines to dig into. And basically the record ends with the death of God, in a certain sense, with the song Styrofoam Boots, where the God is imagined as someone who looks just like everyone else, basically, who is indistinguishable from the rest of humanity. And so essentially it's this song about the idea of the idea of religion, the idea of a leader being this kind of like figment of your imagination, like not just that, but like really that God, if he exists, is powerless basically, and is not actually running anything, is just this creator who has no ability to control or do or change anything, and has no interest in doing that either. He is interested in taking care of himself. And the record actually ends in this really nihilistic place with that line, God takes care of himself and you of you. And then yeah, and then the song kind of just explodes. I love the moment in this track where the drums come in. It's really like unexpected. It always makes me jump. And then it just kind of rollicks towards its conclusion with the repetition of the line, it's all nice on ice, all right, which is like this three-way metaphor where it's like, once you're dead, once you're on ice, then you're at peace, then you don't, then the shit that Isaac has sung about on the record no longer matters. And then the other way in which is a metaphor is that when you're on ice, when you're high, when you're doing meth, then it's all nice, then it's everything, the pain goes away. But anyway, basically it's that sentiment to end the record on is this really kind of like nihilistic and dark moment. And yeah, this is a great record. The fact that it's only like my third favorite Modest Mouse record says a lot about the level and the energy that they were on at this particular point, and the pointedness of Isaac's songwriting, the band's ambition. I mean, that is all reflected, I think, in the length of their records, where it's like they're trying to cover so much and they do such a great job of touching on so many different things and pulling you along for the ride the whole way through. It's a great record. Modest Mouse are a great band, and even though I kind of understand why they're not as talked about anymore as they used to be, I mean, because they're just no longer really relevant, I guess, and the records they have put out in recent years have just not been very good. So I see why people don't talk about them so much anymore, but I wish they should, because I feel like if a lot of teenagers, especially these days, were to discover these records, and dig into them, they would probably find a lot that they would resonate with. And it was very important for me to discover this band when I was like 15. And yeah, and the beautiful thing about them is that they speak to you when you're that age. And Moon and Antarctica especially, because that's a record that is specifically about being a kid and growing up. But they're records that speak to you at that age, and then you grow up and you listen to them and you hear new things in them, and you realize that what Isaac is talking about is relevant and resonant in ways that, I mean, it's hard to imagine how he could have known. Like, for instance, in the song Jesus Christ Was an Only Child, you have the lines, working real hard to make internet cash, work your fingers to the bone, sitting on your ass. Like, that's a prophetic. The song was written in 1997. And that's like, I mean, it's certainly the way I live now in 2021. So yeah,
Give us money.
it is a timeless album, I think, that is also very much of its time. And the specific musical scenes in the 90s that it pulls from, Isaac's made a very strong point about not wanting to be thought of as a Seattle band, even though the town of Issaquah is basically just on the outskirts of Seattle. Like the pointedness of distinguishing them from the Seattle scene and the other scenes that were happening in the Pacific Northwest at the time, you can hear kind of the scrappy garage rock of bands, of a whole heap of bands that were popular in the 90s from that particular era. But Modest Mouse, to me, have always been one of the most unique and idiosyncratic and compelling and beautiful. And all of that, everything that makes them all of those things, is here on Lonesome Crowded West. Anyway, favorite tracks and ratings.
My three favorite tracks are Bankrupt on Selling, Cowboy Dan, and Trailer Trash. My least favorite song is Long Distance Drunk, and I'm going to give the album an 8.5.
My three favorites are Heart Cook's Brain, Trucker's Atlas, and Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine. And my least favorite is Long Distance Drunk. And I will give this a 7.5 out of 10.
Okay, my three favorite tracks. Yeah, so Cowboy Dan, Polar Opposites, and I'm going to say Teeth Like God's Shoe Shine. Least favorite track is Long Distance Drunk, and the album gets a 9.5 from me. Okay, well, let us know at home what you think of the Lonesome Crowded West. What does this record mean to you? What is your favorite Modest Mouse record? Let us know in the comments below. Hit us up on Twitter as well if you haven't already, and check out our main reviews this week as well, which will already be up on our YouTube page. Rock over London, rock on Chicago. Jaws, the terrifying motion picture from the terrifying #1 bestseller.